a cooler way that researchers kind of figure out what stuff happens in the brain is through studying patients with brain damage. So we're going to do a case study. One of the most famous individuals with hippocampus damage is a patient named HM. His real name is Henry Meliasen. So fun fact, people tend to refer to patients by their initials while they're still alive, but since this man has passed away, his name is fully released. So you might see both used. Now, HM was an individual who suffered pretty heavily from seizures. And in order to kind of solve that, the doctors at the time, this was pretty early in the mid-1900s, decided to remove both of his hippocampi. So this is an example of what his brain looked like. So again, in a normal brain, you see really heavy gray matter. This is just pretty thick structure of where hippocampus is. But his hippocampus was removed, so literally it's just blank space. He doesn't have any hippocampus anymore. So what we know about HM, we know that he tends to do okay on working memory tasks, but doesn't do well on long-term memory tasks. So let's break down what that can tell us about where these processes are in the brain. So things that he has intact. He is still able to hold small bits of information in his working memory. So what might that tell us? If he doesn't have a hippocampus, but he can still use working memory, that must mean that working memory does not require the hippocampus. And in fact, working memory tends to be in the frontal lobe. If you remember from neurosciences lecture, the prefrontal cortex is the home to all kind of complex cognitive actions, decision-making, judgments, that kind of thing. So anytime you're working actively with information and processing it, it's in your frontal lobe, not in your hippocampus. But he could not form new declarative episodic memories. So he had a version of amnesia called anterograde amnesia, where you couldn't form new memories. That must tell us that declarative episodic memories do require the hippocampus to form. But some additional work in other patients have shown that damage of the prefrontal cortex also leads to impairment with episodic memories. So we know that these declarative episodic memories tend to be stored or require both the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. Okay, back to HM. HM could also learn new procedural tasks. So let's think back to what we know about what procedural memory is. One of the famous examples of this, he was given a mirror tracing task. So what this is your vision is blocked in front of a piece of paper, and you can only see that piece of paper reflected in a mirror. And your task was to look in the mirror and try to trace the image of a star. Now, if you've ever done this, you should try it. It's so difficult. The first time you do this, you're going to be really shaky. You're not going to be able to draw straight lines very well. It's going to be really hard, right? But over time, the first day he did this, he had a lot of errors. But after each consecutive day, he got better at this task. So even though he could not remember that he had ever done this task before, the skilled practice of it was kept. He was able to make this new procedural skilled memory. So that must tell us that procedural memory doesn't require the hippocampus either. So this has given us a great stepping stone for where certain parts of memories are. It taught us about episodic memories and the fact that procedural memories aren't in the hippocampus. But what about some of the other aspects of declarative memory? What about semantic memories, for instance? So let's think back to our, again, neuroscience chapter. Remember how we talked about the temporal lobe being involved in a lot of higher level sensory processing information, being able to identify visual objects. So like, this is a face, or this is a scene, this is a tool, etc. So semantic information, facts, things, recognizing things, is distributed all across the cortex. And there are a lot of examples of certain visual categories in the temporal lobe. So semantic memories aren't in the hippocampus, they're distributed across the cortex. Okay, but what about procedural? So We know procedural memories aren't in the hippocampus, so where are they? Well, when you're learning a new skill, for instance, learning to drive for the first time, your frontal lobe is pretty heavily involved. But as you continue to learn that skill, its function gets transferred to the basal ganglia instead. So if you remember this back, basal ganglia is in charge of voluntary kind of movements. So this is why things like distractions are especially dangerous for newer drivers. So they tend to be fully engaged driving with their frontal lobes, and so competing stimuli can lead to drastic mistakes in driving. But once driving becomes more automatic and it becomes controlled by your basal ganglia, other distractions like having music in the car or having a passenger isn't as detrimental. So again, this is different from where episodic memories are stored. So you might be able to do a thing like driving a car without necessarily remembering when or how you learned to do that thing.